This is a video tutorial for Module 2 of Phil 123. The topic for this particular module is the teleological argument. This is Tofu. She will be our guest lecturer for this particular tutorial. I want to talk in this particular tutorial about the teleological argument. And to explain what the teleological argument is, it's going to be really helpful to talk about the proof arguments quite generally and explain what's unique about the teleological argument. When we're talking about the proof arguments, in general terms, we're talking about arguments that purport to establish that God exists. The conclusion of any one of the proof arguments is that God exists. And if any one of the proof arguments works, that would be a substantial philosophical accomplishment. It would generate knowledge. It would give us certainty that we could know that in fact God exists. A proof argument is not simply an assumption. It's not simply faith. It's not simply rhetoric. It's an argument that purports to show that its conclusion is in fact true. Now, what we see is that there's actually three different kinds of proof arguments. The teleological argument The teleological argument is one kind of proof argument. One thing that's interesting to note about the teleological argument is that it has its roots in the Greek language. The Greek word telos, T-E-L-O-S, is actually Greek for the English word purpose. Okay, and that's important. The teleological argument purports to show that God, usually identified with something like an intelligent designer, exists based on the observation that the universe, or perhaps parts of the universe, appear to be purposeful. They appear to be designed for a reason to do certain particular things for some particular outcome. That's the teleological argument in very broad strokes. But there's two other kinds of proof argument, three all told. The teleological argument's one, but there's also the ontological argument. The ontological argument purports to show that God exists based simply upon an analysis of the concept of God. The idea is that once we're clear about what God is like, we see that God has to exist, that there's a kind of incoherence or confusion or contradiction in supposing that God, properly understood, doesn't exist. It would be like imagining a triangle with four sides that's confused, that's incoherent, that's a contradiction. The ontological argument purports to show that thinking about God is kind of like that. The third kind of proof argument is the cosmological argument. The cosmological argument, there's various versions of it, but they all purport to show that God exists based on some observable fact about the universe. We see that things change. To explain that, we conclude that there must be an unchanging changer, and that's God. Or we see that some things move, so we imagine that there must be a first mover, itself unmoved, that's God, and so on and so forth. So those are the three kinds of proof arguments: the teleological argument, the ontological argument, and the cosmological argument. We'll talk about two of those arguments in Module 3. In this particular module, we'll be most interested in learning about the teleological argument. To do that, notice what's distinctive about the teleological argument. If you look a bit farther down on handout number 2, you'll see a table that divides up these three different kinds of proof arguments based upon different properties. Now, you should already know what a deductive argument is. Okay, that's a concept that should be in the logic section of the Cengage website. But remember that a deductive argument yields the conclusion, a very particular kind of conclusion. It suggests that if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. Another property that we're going to be interested in, though, is whether or not that argument uses a priori reasoning. One possibility is that the argument uses a priori reasoning. Another possibility is that it uses a posteriori reasoning. Now, to understand what those properties mean, to understand what that amounts to, think about what the phrases a priori and a posteriori, those Latin phrases, sound like in English. A priori sounds like the English word prior, something that comes before. The phrase a posteriori in Latin sounds a bit like the English word posterior, after. I think that's helpful. A priori reasoning is reasoning that occurs before experience, or even better, it's reasoning that does not depend upon experience. A posteriori reasoning is reasoning that does depend upon experience. It's reasoning that comes after experience or observation. What am I talking about when I'm talking about experience and observation? The normal kinds of ways in which we look around the world to learn things. Think about the kind of reasoning that scientists do. This is a paradigmatic kind of a posteriori reasoning. We observe things that happen in the universe, maybe we formulate hypotheses and perform experiments to test those particular hypotheses. We see what the world is actually like and try to develop knowledge based on that. But not everybody, not every kind of thinker, not every kind of scholar engages in a posteriori reasoning. Mathematicians, logicians too, don't obviously engage in a posteriori reasoning when they do what they do. Okay? Think similarly about what it is to be a triangle, right? Even if you've never seen a triangle in your life, once you understand what a triangle is, once you think hard about what a triangle is, if someone told you they drew a four-sided triangle, you should know that that's wrong, that they must be mistaken. Once you understand what a bachelor is, if someone tells you that they met a married bachelor, you should conclude that they're mistaken. Even if you've never seen a triangle, even if you've never observed or encountered a bachelor, you could know that there's something wrong with what they're saying. So again, a priori reasoning, reasoning that does not depend upon experience or observation. A priori reasoning, reasoning that does depend. Sorry, let me get that right. A posteriori reasoning, reasoning that does depend on experience and observation. Notice that the ontological argument is typically, really always, understood as a deductive argument, and it depends on a priori reasoning. We'll see examples of this in St. Anselm in Module 3. The cosmological argument is also typically found as a deductive argument, but unlike the ontological argument, the cosmological argument does depend on a posteriori reasoning. It does not depend on a priori reasoning. We observe that things change. We observe that things move. We observe that there are dependent beings. We'll see an example of the cosmological argument in Module 3 as well, its most famous example coming from St. Thomas Aquinas. The teleological argument, notice, is not typically a deductive argument. There are exceptions, but nonetheless it is not typically rendered as a deductive argument. It's usually rendered as an inductive argument. And the speaker who runs this argument typically says not that it must be the case that God exists, but that it's probably the case that God exists. And that'll be important. Notice also that the teleological argument, too, really does depend on experience. It depends on observation. We observe certain features of the universe. We observe that the universe is design-like or purposeful, that its parts are ordered and intricate, that the universe is beautiful, whatever. These are things that we observe about the universe. So the teleological argument really, too, depends on a posteriori reasoning. Okay. Now, historically, there's any number of versions of the teleological argument. One very famous version is captured from the philosopher and biologist William Paley. As you know from the text, Paley asks us to imagine that we're walking across a heath, a kind of open meadow, and we find a stone. Nobody supposes that anybody made the stone. For all we know, the stone might have been there. There's nothing weird about assuming that. Okay? But things are very different, Paley thinks, when we find a watch. No one would assume that the watch had just always been there. Nobody would assume that the watch simply popped out of the ground full grown like an eggplant. Watches are made. They are designed. They have a designer. Now, what Paley is sort of suggesting here in this quote that's on the handout is that what's true of watches is going to be true of the universe as well. That when we observe the universe, we don't conclude that it's like a stone, the sort of thing that doesn't need anyone to make it, that might have, for all we know, always been there. Instead, we conclude that the universe is more like a watch, that it couldn't have always been there, that it must have been a designer. Note towards the end of Paley's quote, he concludes, the inference we think is inevitable, that the watch must have had a maker. I think this is important because not only does it suggest that Paley's giving us a version of the teleological argument, we're supposed to observe that the universe is ordered and purposeful and intricate in the way that a watch is, and not the way like a stone is, but it also suggests that Paley's giving us a kind of deductive version of the teleological argument. The inference is inevitable. The universe must have had a maker. Paley is giving us a deductive version of the teleological argument. Now, this version of the teleological argument in particular is very controversial. Why? Because there's a very influential account of evolutionary biology that denies that anything that appears purposeful or designed must be the product of an intelligent designer. Any number of critters, species, animals, including us, might appear to be purposeful or designed, that our bodies and the parts that make them up intricate and put together for a purpose. But in fact, we're simply the upshot of genetic ancestors from millions and millions of years ago. And the reason we are the way we are now is because of any number of blind and random genetic mutations that resulted in our having opposable thumbs or eyebrows, as opposed to cats who don't have those sorts of things. Do cats have eyebrows? In any case, the first version of the teleological argument is certainly a controversial one, but it's also exceptional because it's run as a deductive argument. The second version of the teleological argument on the handout is what we call the fine-tuning argument. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about this argument. If you want to see more about it, you can take a philosophy of religion class where my colleagues will spend much more time talking about it. The kind of argument that we really want to focus on is the third version, what we're calling the argument by analogy, okay, sometimes called the argument from design. This kind of an argument is, well, an argument by analogy. It purports that because two things, this is an argument by analogy in general, that because two things are similar in other respects, we should expect them to be similar in still more respects. This particular argument by analogy suggests that the universe is very much like a man-made artifact, like a watch or a television set or a computer. Their parts are intricate, they're designed to work together, or at least they appear to be designed to work together. They're beautiful, they're whatever. But there's some kind of design-like property that both, say, a watch and the universe possesses. And since a watch has a designer, we should probably conclude that the universe has a designer as well. This kind of argument is different from the first version of the teleological argument. That first version offered by Paley was a deductive argument. This argument only purports to be an inductive argument. It suggests that it's probably the case that the universe had an intelligent designer to be identified as God, not that it must have such a case, not that it must have such a designer. Now, the classic version of this particular teleological argument is found in Hume's Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. It's offered by the philosopher Cleanthes. We'll talk more about him in the next tutorial. It's interesting, not only does the classic presentation of this teleological argument occur in the Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, the classical refutation of it occurs as well, as offered by the philosopher Philo.